Hi, I'm Andrea and welcome to Productive C Sharp. This video wants to be a quick and practical introduction to Entity Framework Core. I want to show you how you can take an existing database, create a model, and then using Entity Framework Core, and then query this model in order to get some data out of the database. Entity Framework Core is an object relational mapper that is first being created in 2016 by Microsoft, and it's a complete rewrite of the Entity Framework. That is a framework that was created back in 2008 and was running on .NET. The reason of the rewrite is because Entity Framework Core now runs on .NET Core, is open source, is cross-platform, and it's been built with an extensible and modular architecture and also target .NET Standard. So let's start. I have SSMS open and I have AdventureWorks 2017, that is a database you can find online and Microsoft provided, and this is quite a big database with a lot of tables in it. Let's pretend this is a database that we want to actually start using inside our application. How can I use it? Okay, so the first things you need to do is to reference few NuGet packages. You need to reference Entity Framework Core SQL Server, because I'm using a SQL Server database, and Entity Framework Core tools that basically allows you to run some tools that allows you to create a model from a database. And then later on I'll show you how to use the logger in order to see the actual SQL that the framework will generate for you. So the very first things you need to do is to actually create a model from a database. In order to do that, you need to use the package manager console in order to do that. And the tool that you need to use is called Scaffold DB Context. Then you need to provide the connection string to the database that you want to use. Okay, the easiest way to get the connection strings is to use the Server Explorer in Visual Studio and connect to a particular database, like in this case. Then right-click Properties, and you can see the connection strings in the property. I copy that and paste it in here. After that, you need to specify Microsoft.entity framework core.SQL Server. And then you can say the directory where you want this tool to generate the model. And let's say I'm going to put this inside the database /entities. The database is made of various tables, for example, and this table will be the framework will basically create classes that maps to these tables automatically, and these classes are usually called entities, and these classes will be added in these folders. If I press enter, the framework will now connect to the database, look at all the objects in there, and try to automatically generate a model. You can see that if the tool is not able to do a proper mapping, will show warnings. There are some particular types of SQL Server that are not yet supported in Entity Framework Core, like hierarchy ID, for example, that you might be able to work around that, or simply not model that and use a raw SQL in order to access those information. So I'm going to ignore these warnings for now, and I'll show you what actually this tool created. Let's have a look. As you can see now, the folder entities contains quite a lot of classes. And let's have a look, for example, at customer. A customer is just a plain C# class. So one of the good things about Entity Framework is that all the classes that it creates are simple C# classes. There is no dependencies to Entity Framework in those classes. The only class that Entity Framework creates for you that relies on Entity Framework is the context class. In this case, this one is called the database name followed by context. The context class inherits from the DB context class provided by the frameworks and define basically everything that is present in this database. For example, I have a list of addresses, a list of address types, and so on. So the framework creates a sort of one-to-one mappings between tables and objects in .NET. The good things about Entity Framework is that basically allows you to work at a higher level of abstractions. You can think about .NET objects instead of raw SQL when you interact with the database, and you let the framework to write the SQL for you. Okay, so before start to using this context, I want to show you a few other things. One important parameter is to specify which SQL server you are going to use. And the other important thing is the onModel creating method. And this method is the place where you can basically define how the framework maps the relationships in the relational database with the .NET objects, so that all the objects are not related to Entity Frameworks at all. So for example, let's see one of these configurations. For the address field, you can see that as an index and the state province ID, and also you can see that there is a property address line that is required, and there's a maximum length of 60 and stuff like that. You can actually define how these objects will be translated into SQL, or how actually how it maps with SQL, so that Entity Framework knows how to generate the queries for you. And you can even specify the type of columns and stuff like that. So I'm not going into the details, but as you can see, the scaffolding procedures generated a tons of classes, a tons of configuration for you automatically. Okay. Now, let's go into program and let's try to use this DB context in order to do a query. Let's say we want to get all the customers' first names, but only the customer with the first name that start with a Z, right? So I'm going to copy and paste some code that I already created just for simplicity. And so what I did is basically creating an instance of the context. Then I can create a simple query using link in .NET. As you can see, the link statement is fairly obvious. For each customer, check the first name that start with Z and then return it. Note that person is a property inside customer that reference another table that is called person. And this person here contains the first name. So this is a one-to-one relationship between two tables that is abstracted away using object relationships. So you don't need to think about joining two tables when you want to access the first name of a person. You can just use the dot notation to do that. If you go back to the database, you can see that we have a customer table. The customer table contains a person ID, and this person ID is a foreign key to the person table, where the primary key is the business entity ID. Okay? But you don't need to worry about those details because the mapping has been done for you by the Entity Framework. Of course, you can change the mapping as well. And then I say, okay, for each customer, include the person as well. If you don't do that, Entity Framework by default doesn't do the joining in order to get the person information for performance reasons. And then I simply print the account number and the first name. So let me try to run this query and see if it works. So now Entity Framework is creating a session, opening a connection to the database, and then running the query to get this information back. As you can see, it's just printing all the names starting from Z. Okay, when you want to learn how to use Entity Frameworks, you want to understand a bit better how it generates the sequence, or what kind of sequence it generates under the covers, you can use a console logger. It's quite handy. In order to write the logger in, you need to include a NuGet package called the logging console, and then the only thing you need to do is to go in the onConfiguring method and add a bit of settings. And this settings is, you need to use the option builder dot use logger factory. Then you create a new logger factory. So the Entity Framework is very flexible and allows you to pass any sort of logger if you want. But obviously Microsoft provide some helper for you so that you don't need to do all the plumbing yourself. Now looks like it's not finding it. Let's add the missing references in the file, and this should brings in the thing. Okay, now it's been wired up. Now when I run the program, you will see that the SQL that is generated by the framework plus all the various logs that is creating, like some warnings and stuff like that. So but what we are interested about is what is the SQL that is being created, and as you can see, Entity Framework is doing a select on the sales.customer table and then do a left join to the person and mapping person ID and business entity ID from the person table. That's exactly what I've shown you in the relational database inside SMS. And this logger can be very useful for you to understand Entity Framework and see how what's the SQL that is basically generating. Using the context, you can basically do any sort of manipulation on the database. You can create new objects, modify them, and then saving all the changes back to the database. And this is pretty much how you can get started with Entity Framework using an existing database. It's fairly easy to use. You have a database, you tell Entity Framework to generate all the model for you. Entity Framework will generate a context class that you can use fairly easily using LINQ and the normal paradigms they are used to as .NET developers in order to query the database using normal .NET objects. And you don't need to write any SQL code yourself. And this is where the power of Entity Framework Core comes into play. And of course, the Entity Framework Core supports different type of relational databases, not just SQL Server, but other type of databases as well. So of course there's a lot more to learn on this topic, but this is obviously something for the future videos. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.